Hi everybody, today we're going to have a look at a solution to the COVID-19 temperatures challenge. A doctor in a hospital in New York City is checking patients for symptoms of COVID-19. He needs a system that will allow temperature data from a digital thermometer to be added to a total. And finally, output the total, the average, and the number of temperatures that were above 28. So this is the main problem. There is a note here. The system will reject any input that is below 22 and above 45. So those values will not be considered. They will be rejected. Write a program that will allow 100 valid temperatures to be input. So we're going to input 100 valid temperatures into the system. If the user tries to enter any values that match this condition, we're going to reject them. We're only going to accept valid temperatures, and we will be getting 100 of them. So we're going to get 100 valid temperatures, and we're going to output the total, the average, and the number of temperatures greater than 28. So let's just go to our IDE and let's start thinking about this solution. I know that I'm going to do something 100 times. I also know that I'm going to input temperature. This is what I'm going to do 100 times, by the way. I'm going to input a temperature. I'm going to check if it's valid. If it's valid, I'm going to add it to a total. I'm also going to count it if it's greater than 28. And finally, I'm going to output. This is after the 100 things have been processed. This is at the very end of the program, outside of my loop. I'm going to output the total, the average, and the count. So this is what my program is going to do. So let's start to look at this in Python. What I'm going to do 100 times, so let's just set up a for loop then. Whoops. There we go. I'm going to do something 100 times. Now what I'm going to do first is input the temperature. First of all, let's print a message. And what I want to do is just track where I am inside the for loop as the program is running. So I'm going to ask input temp, number, and then I. But of course, I, using the range function, starts at 0. So I'm just going to say I plus 1. So we start at 1. Temperature 1, then temperature 2, then temperature 3, etc., etc. Okay. And then let's get the temperature. Now it is going to be an integer, so I'm going to convert the input to be an integer. Okay? So those two lines of code there are inputting the temperature. So I'm just going to cut that and let's just paste it up there. The next thing we're going to do is check if this temperature that we input is valid. And while it's not valid, we're going to keep asking for a new temperature. So get a temperature and then we're going to check if it's valid. While it's not valid, we're going to keep asking. So while temp, and let's remember, if it's less than 22, it's not valid. If it's greater than 45, it's not valid. So while temp is less than 22, or the temp is greater than 45, we're just going to say, hey, you, mister, print. Invalid entry. Try again. Okay? So if a user tries to enter data that matches these two conditions, we're going to say that's invalid and we need to get another temperature. Please try again, right? So temp equals int input. So this while loop is going to trap the user until they enter a valid input, and we'll see how that works when we run. In fact, let's run our code. Let's not just keep going. Let's test it. So I'm just gonna, let's just bring this out. I'm gonna run. Input temp number 1. Well, I'm gonna enter an invalid number, right? So this is me here now. I'm inputting a temperature, and I'm just gonna enter 1. Now hopefully we're going to go into this loop because 1 is less than 22. That is going to be true. And true or anything is always true. So we will go into this while loop, I hope. Invalid entry! Try again! Let's enter another value that's out of the range, the acceptable range. Invalid entry! Try again! So currently we're trapped in this while loop. And if I enter a valid number, let's say 30, hopefully we're going to get out. There's nothing that's going to happen. We haven't coded it yet, but let's get out of the loop. Oh yeah, okay, so of course we're still in the for loop. So that's the end of that iteration of the for loop, and now we go back up here. I becomes 1, so now we're going to input temperature number 2. Invalid entry. That should be okay. Input temperature number 3. Invalid entry. Invalid entry. Invalid entry. That should be valid. And now we can input temperature number 4. So all of these entries, only some of them are valid. Okay, so that's how that works. Now let's move on. By the time we get to this point, I'm just going to call it point 1. By the time we get here, sorry, I'm just going to cut this above the while loop so I can kind of explain what that's doing. Okay, so by the time the program gets to point 1, I'm still in the for loop, and definitely I have a valid temperature because I managed to get out of that while loop. I'm out. I got to point 1. Brilliant. So now I can add that temperature to a total. Oh, so what we have to do before we go into our for loop is set up a variable to store the total. So let's declare a variable called total, and we will assign it an initial value of 0. So that's happening before we start to get our numbers. Now let's update the total. Brilliant. So that's that done. Next, we need to count if the temperature that we got is greater than 28. Okay, so if it's greater than 28, we're going to count it. We're still in the for loop. We're still processing data. So if temp is greater than 28, we're going to add it to a count. We're going to increment a count. Now, of course, I haven't declared this yet at the top of my program. I need to do that as well. Count equals 0. So declare the variable and initialize it to 0. And I believe that is the end of my for loop. We get a temperature. We check if it's valid. If it's valid, we add it to a total. And if it's greater than 28, we update the count. And then we do it again. We're going to do this 100 times. Now, let's output the total, the average, and the count. So let's just do that. The average, of course, is the total divided by 100. And the count is Now, I'm not going to test this with 100 values because that's going to take forever. I'm going to test it with 5 values, 5 valid temperatures. So let's just try and run this thing. Input temp number 1, 0. Invalid, -1. Invalid, 48. Invalid. Let's go to the very edge of the range, 45. I'm now doing some boundary checking of my range. That should be valid. Yes, okay. Now I'm going to input temp number 2, should be valid. Input temp number 3, should be valid. Input temp number 4, let's put in another valid one. And temp number 5, just to mess around. Some extreme data there. And now I'm going to try that again. And there we have it. The total is 170. The average is 1 point. That looks wrong, actually. The count is 5. That's right. The count is right. The average is 1.7. That doesn't look right. I'm going to have to look at my code, but that is a sample solution to the COVID temperature challenge.